The Russian revolutions of 1917 ended Russian involvement in the First World War, but they precipitated a destructive civil war that drew in international powers and lasted for years as the Bolsheviks attempted to establish control over the whole of the former Russian Empire. And for a while, that chaos allowed all manner of small movements and petty warlords to thrive, among them the Bloody Baron of Mongolia, Roman von Ungern-Sternberg, a man of daring but brutal reputation, who lived a colorful and outrageous life that culminated in an attempt to restore the empire of Genghis Khan. History that deserves to be remembered. Nikolai Robert Maximilian von Ungern-Sternberg, known as Roman in Russian, was born in Austria in 1886 to a Baltic German noble family. The Baltic Germans were ethnic Germans who lived along the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea, primarily in modern-day Latvia and Estonia. After the Baltic Crusades in the Middle Ages, large numbers of Germans had lived in the region, especially as merchants, clergy, and landed nobility. He also claimed descent from Batu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's grandchildren, which is part of what made him dream of reviving a Mongol empire. Ungern's life has become intermixed heavily with legend that has grown about his exploits. Much of his life took place amid the chaos of a particularly chaotic war and in some of the most remote areas of the planet. In his book on the Russian Civil War in Central Asia, Peter Hopkirk wrote that truth and legend about the Mad Baron are so inextricably mixed that it is difficult to be sure where one ends and the other begins. Finding the historical Baron in what few sources we have is a challenge. That uncertainty extends even to his physical appearance. While we have a number of photographs, none are in color, and unlike various sources describe his hair as red or yellow, his eyes as blue or gray. He grew up in the Baltics on an estate outside modern Tallinn, now the capital of Estonia. According to James Palmer in his book The Bloody White Baron, even in his youth, Ungern was known for making trouble. When he was 12, for no good reason, he assaulted his neighbor's pet owl. When he went to a military-oriented school at 15, he seems to have been obstinate and violent. Friends of his parents remember that he was a terror to his fellow pupils and masters. He fought with classmates, ditched detentions, and generally earned poor grades. War broke out between Japan and Russia in 1904. There's some disagreement on exactly how, but Ungern seems to have gotten involved, though he likely didn't see any combat before the Russian Navy was humiliated at the Battle of Tsushima. Back home, the 1905 Russian Revolution erupted. Peasants vented frustration against nobility and, in Latvia, burned his family's estate. It fueled Ungern's hatred for what he called the rough, untutored, wild, and constantly angry lower classes. He continued his schooling as an army cadet, and by 1908 he had a commission in a Cossack cavalry regiment. In his teenage years, he became obsessed, as his cousin wrote, with Tibetan and Hindu philosophy, which led him to request Far Eastern deployment. The cousin even thought that Ungern could read minds. In 1911, Mongolia had declared independence from China, and Ungern tried to join the resistance, although he seems to have been prevented from serving directly by the Russian government. While there, he adopted Lamaistic Buddhism. His time in the army was marred by poor behavior, including a duel that got him kicked out of a regiment. One writer summarized that he had not the slightest rudiments of common decency or military discipline. In one fight with another soldier, his head was cut by a saber, which some have blamed for his later madness. Between 1914 and 1918, he served with the Russian army in World War I. He fought in the Russian offensive against East Prussia and on rear-action raids against German soldiers, and in the Caucasus against the Ottomans. He gained a reputation as a brave but reckless and even unstable officer. He was famous for leading cavalry charges with apparently no fear of death, and was decorated with a number of medals, including the Order of St. George. The abdication of the Tsar in February 1917, however, was a major blow to Ungern, who was a loyal monarchist. In the interim, between the February Revolution that overthrew the Romanovs, but before the Communist Revolution in October, Ungern organized an Assyrian Christian unit made up of Assyrian Christians fleeing genocide in the Ottoman Empire. Together with another man who had gained a reputation for brutality, General Grigory Semyonov, he then headed east to Siberia to recruit a regiment made up of nomadic Buryat. He was there when the provisional government was overthrown and the Bolsheviks seized power. While the communists had amassed significant power, they were far from the only people who wanted to control Russia's fate. And in Siberia, Ungern and Semyonov both declared for the Tsarist side, making them whites. The whites were a loose collection of ethnic, ideological, and political movements across a large spectrum, united only in their resistance to the Red Communists. In Russia's Far East, chaos reigned in the first days after the October revolutions. While the communists consolidated their grip on the West, parties in the East splintered and turned to brigandry. Ungern became forming an ambitious and perhaps demented plan. China was even then moving soldiers into Mongolia, stamping out its autonomy and preparing for the chaos in Russia to pour over the border. Ungern's delusions were growing. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Genghis Khan and hoped to chase the Chinese out of Mongolia, from which he could rebuild the old Mongolian Empire. He began recruiting an army, wearing a cherry-red Chinese jacket and blue Imperial Russian Army breeches. One of his soldiers, Dmitry Ilyushin, recalled Ungern's brutal recruitment techniques. He would look each recruit over and proclaim, "To the army, back to the cattle," or "liquidate." All men with physical defects were shot until only the able-bodied remained. He killed all Jews. Hundreds of innocent people were liquidated. In a twisted form of Buddhism, he decided that killing the weak would only benefit the dead, as they would be reincarnated stronger. There is some disagreement about the number of atrocities attributed to him. Some of it comes from Dmitry Ilyushin's book, but there is doubt over the details of his account. Sergei Kuzmin of the Russian Academy of Sciences says that while Ungern did maim a doctor, he did not out of caprice, but because the doctor refused to render medical assistance to a particular ethnic group. Kuzmin also disputes the tale that Ungern had the wounded poisoned, pointing out that several other memoirs say that Ungern had a man shot for poisoning the wounded. Certainly he was surrounded by violence, but the details are very much in question. Japan provided some support to the various white forces, and some advisors were reportedly sent to help Ungern. Ungern's army broke off from Semyonovsk to invade Mongolia in the fall of 1920, but estimates of the size of his army vary widely. Ilyushin estimated it at 1,200, while another reported 6,000. Most were white Russians, with a smaller number of local Asian soldiers. He also brought along a number of Buddhist soothsayers and a Mongolian princess that he had made his wife. He may also have had a bodyguard of warriors sent by the Dalai Lama in Tibet. Ungern marched on the Mongolian capital of Urga, now called Ulaanbaatar, leaving terror in his wake. Russian refugees fled in front of him like mice in a burning building. The tales of his terrors abounded, that Ungern had strangled a pair of colonels and whipped a captain to death, how he had burned a village after locking the inhabitants in their homes. He was said to roast deserters by slowly lowering them towards a fire while they hung from a tree. He was especially vicious against Bolsheviks and the Jewish. On October 26, 1920, Ungern attacked Urga. The Chinese outnumbered him, and they were dug in, and they repelled his attacks. Ungern was forced to withdraw and seek more recruits. With a larger force, it's not known how much larger, he attacked again in January of 1921. He was still seriously outnumbered, but he covered for it by having his men light huge fires in the hills on the night of January 31st. He planned to attack from 3 directions at the dead of night, but his artillery was slow and didn't begin bombardment until dawn. They freed the Mongolian Khan, or living Buddha, and pressed their attack. In the first days of February, he took the city. Some accounts say Ungern allowed his men days of destruction, but James Boyd, author of a biography of Ungern, argues instead that Ungern ended the looting quickly by immediately hanging looters. With Mongolia in hand and the Bogd Khan put in place as a puppet leader, Ungern had the beginning of his new empire. He was given the rank of lieutenant general by Semyonov and a variously rendered title by the Khan. One account claims that the Khan endorsed Ungern's name to be the incarnated god of war and Khan of grateful Mongolia, while other scholars say he was made great hero general or hereditary grand duke. He declared that he would construct an avenue of gallows from Mongolia to Moscow in a great crusade against the Bolsheviks. On May 27, 1921, he declared himself Emperor of Russia. He prepared to march on Moscow by visiting Buddhist shrines and soothsayers. Especially among the Mongolians, he gained a reputation for invincibility, as rumors spread that he had once killed a Chinese officer and 2 men with only a bamboo stick, or that in a single battle 74 bullets had hit his coat or saddle, but he had been unharmed. A Polish writer who was there at the time claims that the Buddhist oracles told Ungern that he had only 130 days to live, and Ungern responded that he might die, but the cause has been launched and will not die. There will be a great state from the Pacific and Indian Oceans to the shore of the Volga. On the same day he declared himself emperor, he marched towards Russia. He also reportedly gave an order to kill all commissars, communists, and Jews. Today, only one form of punishment is acceptable: death, by varying degrees. The occultist predicted victory, and he promised his men that the Reds would desert by the thousands to join his banner. But the situation for the Whites had deteriorated by 1921. They were defeated across nearly every front, and most of the forces in Siberia had evaporated. Even Semyonov's forces further east were struggling, and Japan had exited the conflict. Anti-communist forces in Central Asia had collapsed, as had other anti-Bolshevik forces in Poland and Crimea. Ungern's shaky regime in Mongolia gave the Soviets an opportunity as well. Russia had been eyeing Mongolia for years, and Ungern had helpfully thrown out the Chinese and destabilized the region. At the request of the Mongolian People's Party, Soviet forces had begun infiltrating Mongolia to erode support for the Baron. Red forces were concentrating on the border. Things didn't go the way Ungern expected. No rush of recruits appeared, and the Reds were ready for him. He crossed the border, but in a series of battles in mid-June was forced back into Mongolia. Descriptions of these battles are sparse. Hopkirk relates a 6-hour battle in which the attacking Red cavalry was finally driven off, triumphantly pursued by a squadron of the Baron's own horsemen. But the Bolshevik commander proved more than a match for the Baron, who, for all his fanatical courage, had regularly failed his tactical examinations. The White cavalry charged straight into an ambush. One of Ungern's men wrote of the battle later that, "We were in the middle of the forest when the Reds opened up a deadly fire. Our men were swept from their feet like grass before a scythe." The White forces were ambushed again in the early morning. "In great panic, half asleep and barely dressed, our men ran headlong," described the White soldier. The Baron tried to rally his men with sheer bravery, but the whole force was surrounded. His men broke, cutting horses from their guns, abandoning the wounded and supplies, and dashing madly into the hills. The Baron was able to withdraw and make a second foray into Soviet territory. They destroyed a Red Army force, although it's unclear how large. They took no prisoners, making the captured dig their own graves. Red nurses were handed over to the army. But Ungern's victories meant little. Urga had been captured by the Reds behind him at the invitation of the Soviet Mongolian puppet government. Ungern had no choice but to attempt to flee at the head of a demoralized army. He had lost his hat and most of his clothes, and on his naked chest numerous Mongolian talismans hung on a bright yellow cord. His men mutinied, attempting to kill him in his sleep, but he miraculously survived, taking to his horse and fleeing. He was finally found later on the ground, wounded by a Red patrol on August 20th, with no exact report of his capture to be found. Ungern was brought to Novosibirsk in Siberia, where a show trial commenced. He was accused of trying to overthrow the government and restore the monarchy and countless atrocities. An American report says that it was an extraordinary trial. Hundreds of workers, peasants, soldiers jammed into the courtroom. Thousands more stood outside in the street. Many of these people had lived through Ungern's reign of terror. Their brothers, children, and wives had been shot, tortured, or hurled into the boilers of locomotives. Ungern remained defiant. "For 1,000 years, Ungerns have given other people orders. We have never taken orders from anyone. I refuse to accept the authority of the working class." He didn't deny the charges, saying that he'd killed people because they were too red. He was found, of course, guilty, and on September 15th, killed by firing squad, ending his short-lived Mongolian Empire. His death didn't go unnoticed. When the Bogd Khan heard of his execution, he ordered that services be held throughout Mongolia. Despite his failures, he did end up becoming important to history, though not in the way he probably would have preferred. His invasion of Mongolia and defeat of the Chinese there, as well as his brutality, paved the way for the Soviet control of Mongolia. As John Jennings, a professor of history at the United States Air Force Academy, notes, Ungern essentially ensured the spread of the thing that he hated most, communism, because the creation of the Mongolian People's Republic likely would not have happened were it not for his actions. But in the end, he might actually have served the land of Genghis Khan, because that is the reason that today there is an independent Mongolia as opposed to one that's under Chinese rule. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.